Well, hello everyone, and welcome to an amazing February. Yes, the day after Valentine's Day. Thank you all for joining us today at KoreSummit Blockchain Webinar Series 2024. Boy, we are going to have a great topic. The word smart and then contracts. Wow. I know Kiran and I, over the years, we've had a lot of fun with that first word, smart. But before we get started, you know what I often keep forgetting? Someone sent me a message, but I think most everybody, who is this guy that gets on the, my name is Oscar Jofre, so I do apologize. I'm the co-founder CEO of KoreChain, so I'm sorry. Sometimes I get carried away. So excited to jump into the topic that I often forget. All right. So today we're going to be talking about blockchain and the smart contract. But before we do, first of all, I want to thank our sponsors, Nuvei, a publicly traded company supporting the private capital markets. Can't say enough about them. The private capital markets really needed a company like them to come in and provide the payment rails in order for investors to facilitate their transactions. So thanks to them, and of course, KoreChain, one of the first companies in the blockchain space that had gone through the SEC, had their blockchain qualified. Really honored, obviously, selfishly honored, because it's a company that Kiran and I are the co-founders of. So, all right, but enough about them. Now let's talk about the real fun topic today. If you all haven't forgotten, Kiran, could you please take a moment, introduce yourself? And I should say it's Dr. Kiran Garimella, please, as we do have other fellow scholars in the room.
Thank you, Oscar. I am Kiran Garimella, and I'm the Chief Scientist and CTO at KoreConnex and KoreChain. I've been in the financial market space for many, many years. I have my PhD in artificial intelligence way back when people didn't realize it was actually an artificial intelligence, back in the early 90s, late 80s to the early 90s. And since then, I've been involved in this financial space in various roles. As an executive at General Electric, I was a global CIO at one of their companies, but I've also been a investor and a trader myself. I used to trade futures contracts with my own fund. So I have some experience in this space, and obviously over the last several years in the blockchain space. And along the way, I wrote 3 books, 2 on process management and 1 on AI plus blockchain, which came out in 2018.
And of course, you left out our book because my book wasn't important enough for you to say, but that's okay. I
was leaving the best for the last.
Oh, okay. That's even better. So I know you started with artificial intelligence, and here's that word intelligence and smart. And it's interesting, going back, the words we use to describe certain things, it's kind of funny because and they're so smart that we need to have all these conversations about it to make sure that people have a fairly good understanding of it. And obviously, for everyone here today, if you watched any of our previous webinars, we already talked about what blockchain is. So we're going to skip that part up today. And if for whatever reason you still need that, if you watch the first webinar of this series, you can get that information, because it will help you understand this element, which is now the smart contract. So Mr. Intelligent, as they say with the AI, tell us, I keep laughing about smart contract because there's so much dispute around them, and we'll get to that as well. But tell us what smart contracts are. What's the big, I don't want to say a buzz, but when people talk about blockchain, hey, we got to put a smart contract on that, and
Yep.
boom, it's like it solves all the problems. Tell us what it is on a basic level, and then we can talk about where it can be applied.
Absolutely. So, at its most basic level, a smart contract is nothing more than a piece of code. It's a programming computer code that's sort of sitting there minding its own business. And when certain conditions are triggered, something happens, it wakes up and says, oh, now I have to do something. Whatever that processing is. And we'll talk about several ways that smart contracts can be positioned, the things that they can actually do. But and so at the end of the day, it really is just nothing more than a piece of software that's waiting for the right conditions to come along. And when they do, it fires up, it wakes up, and it does certain processing. So simple examples like this are, if I'm buying something from a third party, and if the payment has, so only when the payment has gone through is a shipment going to be released. And that's sort of an agreement between the two parties. And what the smart contract does, it kind of waits for the first person to send the payment and make sure it is actually settled, and then fires up a signal to send the shipment out, right? So the big interesting thing about smart contracts is the fact that it makes the necessity for a third party intermediary to manage this agreement sort of redundant. So it removes the need for that one. But one of the interesting things I want to talk about really is, and we'll get a little deeper into this, I know, is the conjunction of the word smart with the word contract. And I have to share a little anecdote here with you. Several years ago, one of the co-founders of Ethereum, there was a YouTube video on this one. This was an Ethereum conference, and this one of these co-founders said, "We started this whole revolution about smart contracts with Ethereum. Ethereum really made it very popular." And he said, "It was probably a bit of a misnomer because a smart contract is really nothing more than a stored procedure. So people in the database field understand what a stored procedure is, which kind of basically sits there in the database. And when certain conditions happen in the database, it wakes up and does certain things. It's a very similar concept. But there are some interesting differences between them. So in that sense, it is really not smart. So, I usually tell most people about this. I'll say there are two things that you need to know about smart contracts. Number one, they're not smart. And number two, they're not contracts. And, being in this intersection of both the AI space and then the legal space, because I used to do a lot of, legal work, and, I was trained to be a CPA myself. So I had to study contract law. So for me, it is a little ironic that smart contracts are somehow deemed to be both AI intelligent and legal contracts, but more on that later.
Okay. So, yeah, you brought up kind of 2, 3 points, but that's interesting. And you're right. I mean, anybody in the software industry, enterprise level, would be going, wait a minute, we're already doing this with our code. And the others would argue that this is very different. I think the immutability is the difference. I think that's one coherent difference between using blockchain and any traditional database. That immutability, once it's written, once it's there, the user, it executes that contract. You can't go in there and edit that function. Well, sorry, you can't delete that function, some of the steps after it's taken place, correct? I mean, that's the whole premise of
Absolutely.
blockchain, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you touched on the key value proposition of smart contracts within a blockchain context. So generally, when you talk about blockchain, it's always going to be in a sort of a highly distributed, decentralized type of network of participants. And so, just as a small bit of comparison, so if you look at something like a localized, centralized database and triggers and smart, stored procedures running on that, it's all self-contained within that environment. And the admins of the database, they can operate that, they can delete it, yeah, they can override it, they can change things, based on their specific needs. And that's what a stored procedure really is. But now you come to a smart contract, the game changes quite a bit. Then some of the value propositions of blockchain start to kick in, because once you deploy a smart contract, you can't change it. It's there, it's immutable, right? You can have a different version of it later, but the earlier version and all
It
the
stays there.
transactions, it stays there. All the
It
transactions
stays
mediated
there.
by, exactly. And the only other
It's
big
not
difference
the
is,
Sorry, it's not the days where, hey, we got some mistakes, we'll go out and correct it later. This one, you really need to think of. You need to go through and understand it, because whatever you put into
absolutely.
it, and that's a really, I want to highlight that, because
Yeah.
we've obviously seen, as we talk deeper into the smart contracts and private market, we've seen how everybody rushed in to create smart contracts for securities, and we'll get there, and they missed 99% of it. And then after that, once it's done, you can't alter what you've done. It is what it is.
Yeah, and that is a limitation of smart contracts. And people say, "Oh my God, I made an error. What do I do now?" Well, you can't change it now, but it is also a trust building technology, because once it's there, it's written. No one can change that, and there's no deniability once it's done, right? So there's a bit of a security and safety for participants to know that no other participant can go in there and muck around with this. That may not necessarily be true in centralized databases. I mean, people can go in there and they can say, "Oh, your sysadmins maybe went and changed something. So how can we be sure it didn't actually happen, right?" So it's a lot more secure from that perspective.
Yeah, it's so let's talk a little bit some of the applications. So we let's not get too much into the legal side. Well, we will a little bit, but the applications, obviously there are many different areas, right? We've only where these stored steps can be, but now it's in a smart contract where it's really applicable. Healthcare could be one of those.
Yep.
The medical industry, we don't hear a lot about it because, again, I think, as you said, if you're going to implement something like this, a smart contract in that you're going to really need to test it out thoroughly just with test data to make sure.
Absolutely. 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 And one of the big challenges, Oscar, in the development of smart contracts is the fact that they're all written by programmers. And everyone knows that software is cannot be proven to be bug free. So it can be reasonably established it's bug free, but no one can prove that there's no bug in the software, right? This is one of those technical things in computer science. And when programmers write software code and smart contracts, so what do we do when things go wrong? How do we recover something like that? So those kinds of things need to be really thought about when designing smart contracts.
So tell us a little. Give. Let's talk about some examples of smart contracts where there's some really good cases. So we talk about healthcare. Share with us some. I mean, we're going to dive into the. So I want to make sure that the general people that are listening in don't think that because it's only for financial, because that's all we're seeing right now, right? And I know everybody
Absolutely.
wants it to jump into there, but I want to make sure people understand there are other business cases where smart contracts can be utilized and used. Real estate is one. Real estate transactions. I mean, there's one case in point that I think that it's definitely been there. I know that there's a group working in shipping. We don't hear,
Yep.
they don't get a lot of buzz because it's not sexy and people go shipping. Well, you said it. I mean, you buy something, triggers the payment triggers the delivery, and then the shipping container, and they get paid based on where they are. You don't need a human being anymore. It can just simply, the smart contract can do the work for you. So these are,
Absolutely.
there are certain environments that lend themselves to adding a smart contract to replace the inefficiencies in way things are operated, but it's done that way all the time. Where other industries is still fluid, so as you introduce something, it may not be it may be good at that moment, but you'll have to
Yep.
create a brand new one again. So, are, do any other environments run to your mind where smart contracts
Yeah.
can be utilized?
Yeah, so the general framework I can offer is the following. When would something like smart contracts or blockchain in general be extremely helpful? Is it's in widely distributed networks that usually cross multi-jurisdictional boundaries. So that's one big use case. The other one is where there's no central intermediary for all the types of transactions that actually happen, or there are multiple central intermediaries in different jurisdictions that need to coordinate to make a transaction happen. Or the third thing is healthcare is a classic example where even if it is localized to the United States, one particular country, the ecosystem is so chaotic. There are payers and insurers and hospitals and doctors and pharmas and dentists and medical practice buildings, and there's a whole host of participants, and the whole notion of who gets to see what in the patient data and is exposed to the sensitive data like this is highly problematical. So these are major considerations. So if you take an example of the healthcare field, if you go to a doctor and they'll say, well, we need your medical history. if you go there for a specific type of a disease or a specific complaint, there's no reason why the doctor needs to know about something else that may have happened, something sensitive many, many years ago. So the ability to restrict information like this by having a smart contract with multi-party signatures on a blockchain is one of the classic use cases, because once your medical records are exposed, the RN gets to see that, the front office administrator gets to see that, the insurer gets to see that, the doctor who does a case gets to see that, which is probably the only legal valid thing they need to see. So, but why do all these other people need this stuff, right? So you don't know. So there's some really good innovation happening in this space. There's a lot. I know people don't hear about it because the real companies doing this stuff are all, they're very busy and not worrying about writing blogs and exposing all this stuff. So they do this. Shipping, intermodal shipping, cross country jurisdictional shipping is another classic example. Just being able to coordinate,
Yeah.
you know what happens, right? There was one company I was consulting with many years ago called Fonterra up in New Zealand. And they're in the dairy product. They account for like 25% of New Zealand's GDP. And from the cow, then the dairy product business. So from cow to cup, the product moves between 40 jurisdictions, 40 countries, right? And you think about intermodal transportation, the way it happens, the whole thing is very, very chaotic for them. So lack of visibility and transparency is another big issue for it. That's kind of where the blockchain and smart contracts can really help.
And the important thing here is that when people think of smart contracts, and I mean, the takeaway for everybody here before we jump into our big topic is that smart contracts have to be seen where inefficiencies currently exist, where this efficiency, where it's repetitive. You know what needs to happen here. But most importantly, and I think you said it, there's no disregard here to software developers. In fact, we applaud them because without their skill set to program this, but you still need the domain expertise in order to craft what is required in order to make sure that there are no missteps. From a software developer point of view, I may not want that. I don't know what that is, but from a from a process point of view, from a trigger, these are important elements. Attestations, which we're going to get into here very quickly, are becoming increasingly critical. So, for anybody listening in, obviously the evolution of blockchain is growing. That's number one. The evolution of the using of blockchain for smart contracts in your everyday business is growing. Can a company use smart contracts to create agreements between clients when they're signing in for the monthly subscription? The answer is yes. Um, you know, is it a practical use for it? Well, that's only for you to decide if you feel that there's going to be any ongoing issues. To date, the contract laws today, it's pretty good. I mean, but there are different business cases where you can use it, not just for contractual agreement, but merely making sure that all the things that are meant to be taking place are done. And would you like to add to that before we move into our big
Yeah.
discussion point?
Yeah, no, certainly. I think the one thing I like to add, which is actually very applicable in the other discussion topic we'll get into soon, is that as businesses are growing extremely global and interconnected, one of the major shifts that's been happening over the last several years is a prevalence of more what we call agency contracts, right? So people are acting more in the relationship of a principal and an agent versus employer employee, which is very restricted and much more controlled. Now you have principal and agent. And one of our participants made a very good comment on this one, Jim Scott, where you can actually have an agency relationship and release payments on a schedule based on when the agent is actually fulfilling certain things, right? So it's performance
Yeah.
guarantees and so on. So it's pretty interesting the way it's going. And in fact, the whole smart contracts and blockchain has a tremendous impact in solving what is called the agency problem, the moral hazard, information asymmetry, and things like that. But all of these are actually very applicable in many industries, but especially so in the financial industry as well. So, Oscar, you pointed out a very important lens, and that is smart contracts are usually written not just for processing efficiency, but also with a viewpoint of an agreement between two parties. That's the context in which the smart contracts actually live.
Yeah, it just, when people hear the word contract, it's like signing, but it's actually we're agreement. You agree to do this when that, and but again, it's important. I think for anyone engaging or crafting or anything, just make sure that one of the things we learned in the last 8-9 years in blockchain and everyone. Now we're going to move into our subject, capital markets, is that you can jump into something and immediately start using without realizing all these other things. You need to unveil what all of it is before, because once you do it, you can't undo it. And if you put a transaction through it, that transaction will live there forever, and it becomes a footprint, for your business. So it's really important that people look at that. So let's jump into, obviously, the Core Summit, all about the private capital markets, and there's been such a buzz. Not, I don't even want to say buzz. I mean, it's the constant messaging out there. Smart contract. We have a new smart contract. This smart contract is going to do this for the capital market. So for everybody listening in, there are two sides to, they often people use the word financial. So we're not talking here about banking on smart contracts. We're not going to have that discussion because we're not in the banking part. We're going to talk about the capital markets. So just as a quick refresher for everyone, capital markets refer to this, where we have a company who wishes to sell a security or a token or an NFT, and where there's a buyer on the other side or an investor who wishes to purchase that, and who will then make that purchase and then be able to um, do certain things with it depending on a number of factors. And these are the things that these factors are the things that people missed out on the early days. So let's just unravel that. First of all, let's talk about smart contracts and the capital markets. Tell me where do you see all the different places where smart contracts should be applied based on in the smart private markets today?
In the private markets, I think the biggest challenge has been the fact that it's highly decentralized, it's very extremely wide, and there are no necessarily always trusted intermediaries kind of managing all this, right? So if you look at the complete life cycle of transactions that happen in the private capital markets, so it's basically raising the money, the issuance process, right? So that's number one. Second part of that is the compliance requirements. Have companies behave in a compliant manner when they advertise or solicit or attract investors, and are the investors of the right type? Are they qualified to actually make investments based on various regulations? And do the jurisdictional rules actually apply? And then running the KYC, AML, sanctions, screening, that portion. But once all that is done, and raising the capital is only, as Oscar, we always talk about, it's only 5% of the time of the life cycle of a digital asset is spent in its raising. That's the birth of it, right? The rest of the 95% is just living on the books, on the cap table, and shareholder management portion of that, and then the trading. There's also a trading element to this one. So anything that happens to the digital security now, or the token, if you will, the security token on the cap table, all of that needs to be hooked up properly with smart contracts to make sure that any transfers, any type of corporate actions, any type of voting that happens, all of those things are compliant in some way. And then the third part is the freely trading token, which happens in secondary markets, the ATS platform, so to speak. Is all of that compliant based on various rules and regulations? I mean, there are some provisions, and I would love to see you expand on this one, Oscar, is that for various regulations, there are various provisions for when trades can actually happen, to what extent they can happen, blue sky laws that kind of kick in. All of those provisions, if just think about having smart contracts mediate that in a much more fluid way, it really makes a huge difference, because today trades in the private markets take weeks to settle, right?
I agree. Well, week, not only weeks, months in the old fashioned. So remember what I said earlier. The key to any sector is that you need domain expertise, and not just one. You need multiple sets of it. And if any of you watch our previous session we discussed the whole value proposition of blockchain and private chains versus public chains. And the issue isn't which one is better. The real question is, what is the problem we're trying to solve, and when we're solving that problem, what is the smart contract we're trying to put into that problem? So again, we're in the capital market, so we could only answer from the capital markets. So why is a permission-based chain better than a public chain? And in this case, it's really about the securities regulators, right? The regulators are the reason why this is happening, and because of that, the the component of the regulators laying out the securities law is that people only looked at it. Oh, the regulators only want ID and AML, and we got that covered. But what they didn't realize is that there were other things, and the regulators anticipated that you kept reading everything and everything, and then people soon discovered, whoa, wait a minute. Do you mean there's other things? Yes, there's suitability. And by the way, there's also a rule about who handles these tokens. I'm going to call them tokens because people in the blockchain, let's call them tokens, the underlying layers of security, but it's a token. And because of that, they had a rule based on who could hold those tokens. And that was called an SEC registered transfer agent. And how that person would hold that token and store that token and deploy it was another rule base. Then the last part was, now that it's there, it's been in the company's cap table in some form managing, what can Kiran do with it? And this has been the Achilles component here, as they say in the private markets, is the investor feels trapped in the old way, and blockchain, we're going to open it up. Okay, great. We're going to open it up to secondary market trading. We're going to allow all of this. And now we have a situation where, how does that all transact? And obviously, the companies that went in early on really didn't have an understanding. They thought it was just KYC. Well, guess what? The regulators also created rules for primary, meaning that's when you initially raise the capital. And then they've created different rules when you want to trade. And those rules are, as you alluded to, there's some blue sky provisions that you also have to be listed on the National Securities Manual. And then the big one, this is the big one, what regulation did you specifically use to issue those tokens to that investor? So
Yes.
this is the one that, people have just kind of, what do you mean? Why does that matter? It matters a lot, because if you write a contract where you don't put that provision in, this thing is just going to fall apart and explode. So,
Absolutely.
right, it's a major element that people need to understand. So when we talk about blockchain and smart contracts, for the audience listening in today, we're always talking about the United States. This is the largest private capital markets in the world, $4.5 trillion. I don't care any other regions. I'm a Canadian, and I will say that US is still the best. Some people say they don't have rules. They do. We're not here to talk about crypto, because crypto is a commodity. A commodity is totally different. And as long as it stays a commodity, it stays in one bucket. Companies like Binance and Coinbase are going to do extremely well doing that. We're talking about a smart contract and the application of securities law. And securities law is different in every country. In Canada, there are 13 securities regulators. Every country's got different regulators. US has got one. You got to follow it. You got to follow the regulation, and you can't just read the surface of it. A lot of people go, "Oh, there's that regulation. Yeah, I can take on investors from anywhere, and I'm ready to go." No, no, no. You got to keep digging. Look what it says there. It needs a SEC transfer agent. Okay, I'll get that. Okay, we can code that in. No, 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 we're not done yet. It needs an auditor. No, 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 we're not done yet. And you need, you need a FINRA broker dealer. Okay, so you can't add that once you create it. You really need to understand the whole thing. Otherwise, the smart contract will fall apart. Sorry, Corinne, you were going to say.
No, I know you're 100% right. I mean, I think there's a lot of complexity in this space that people don't understand or they are aware of. And typically what's been happening so far is that in the smart contract space in private capital markets or the alternative trading scenarios, it's pretty much being driven by programmers and developers who think they kind of know some of the complexities. And to some extent, they understand the failure modes, what happens between transactions, and they're trying to do that. And then slowly, over this last several years, they've been slowly coming up to speed on some of the other regulations, right? But they're not really legal experts. That's a problem, right? And there's a very interesting question by one of our attendees about ERC 3643. And so that's one of the token standards for real world assets. And the question is CoreConnex compliant or CoreChain compliant with that? Well, let me answer it in a different way. We go way beyond, and right from the get-go, we have been way beyond any of these ERC protocols on security tokens or digital assets, because we come at it not from a processing and ease of decentralization. We come at it from a compliance perspective, right? So I just want to mention a couple of things because it helps set the stage for a few other points we want to make, and that is the contract portion in smart contracts. Today, it's a bit of an inside joke between technology people. The word contract really stands for a programming interface, and that word has been around for a long time. It does not mean a legal contract. Unfortunately, it's been confounded with a legal contract. People got excited by it, right? But it simply it meant that when I publish a service, you send me the inputs, I'll send you the outputs, and that's our contract, and that's it, right? It's not a legal contract. So legal contracts require certain legal provisions to be there based on the contract law principles that most countries today follow. So, for example, there are six principles they need to follow. I'll just mention them. We won't go into that. Things such as offer and acceptance. There must be an offer and acceptance. There must be legal and mental competence by both parties to engage in the contract. They must be unforced. You cannot hold a gun to somebody and enforce a contract, right? There must be mutual consideration. Gifts are not subject to contract law, but mutual consideration, buy and sell, is very important. There must be a moral and legal intent. So you cannot have a Bitcoin contract. You can't call it a contract to assassinate somebody and then take the person to court and say, I assassinated, but you didn't pay, right? That makes no sense, right? And it must be enforceable. So if you look at all these six provisions, if you look at a lot of the transactions that happen in Ethereum and Bitcoin, none of them are probable. They don't stand the light of a court challenge about is it really truly a contract. But you take that, and on top of that, you add securities law. So you got the contract law, then you've got corporate law and corporate provisions in different jurisdictions. And then you have the securities law on top of that, on who can trade under what jurisdictions and blue sky laws and so on. You have to codify all of those. So, I say all this just so that people are aware of the complexity in creating smart contracts in the private market space.
No, agreed. And that, I think that's the other element, that we're not saying this is a legal where the investor sign. It's being utilized in order to give the investor the flexibility. Look, there are certain regulations in the United States that when you apply this, imagine having 30,000 investors. I know people in blockchain. Well, yes, that's what we're talking about. Okay, great. Imagine being the CEO of that company every 5 minutes answering hey, what can I do with my shares or my token? Where can I sell it? What are my rights? Do I get to vote? Am I entitled to this? Am I entitled to that? What can I do? Who can I talk to? Who can I send it to? Who can I? And all of that, once you understand, once you know the regulations, you're putting that in there. And that's the nice thing about this, is that this is not if you bring in all the domain experts into it, you could actually create a smart contract that would be compliant. But even before you start with that, I'm going to come back again because I want to make sure, because yes, people are typing in ERC and, is it compatible with this and this protocol, not protocol. I want to lead back to one more thing. It's when it comes to the securities regulators, it doesn't matter what country you go in the world. The protocol is irrelevant, and so is the whatever you got. All they care about is, here's the regulation. here is what you need to show us and to make sure. So when we went through the front door of the SEC, which you can go to Edgar, because it has to be a public record to everyone to read, so you can copy it and you can build your own chain around it if you like. You need to demonstrate to them how an issuer, a company who's going to utilize the regulation without exemption, what that means is that the company is going to follow the rules as they're currently written and comply while you're using this technology. So this is really important. Comply while they're using this technology. So in
Exactly.
this scenario, the in this scenario, the company goes in with the smart contract and everything, but it's indicating, yes, we are going to be working with a FINRA broker dealer who will file a 5110 and file a Form 1A, following the Form 1A. And this is our auditor with our audit, and this is our legal counsel with our Form 1A. This is our SEC registered transfer agent. Here's our escrow provider, which has to be registered. And here is our payment rail provider. And just in case, I may even have a custodian. And these are the IRA participants I'll be working with. Do you see all of the parties I just kept saying? And here's the part that everybody just sometimes just do not understand. All of these parties, the FINRA broker dealer, the SEC transfer agent, the lawyer, the auditor, the bank, the escrow, all of these participants, they're all regulated by someone else as well. And that was the
Exactly.
missing link that everybody missed in the original. So you need to take all of that and then bring it into, and because what they want to know is that forget about the technology. Are you following the rules that once you issue this security, and you can call it boo boo baba NFT token, whatever you want to call it, once the investor has it, are they being given every single right that they would normally be given before? You just enhanced it, you made it more efficient. That's fantastic. But are you having all the provisions? And the provision is that that investor, the securities are being managed by an SEC transfer agent, a physical management of that security. And I know someone will say, well, we have that over here. Yes, but you can't have two sets of records. You cannot have a blockchain record and another piece of record. That's a, that's a no-no in accounting, and this is a no-no here. And then, of course, what does the investor want to do? The investor wants to trade. And then then we get into another element. So again, the idea of a smart contract in general for the private capital markets, it's not just ID, AML, as people say, hey, I got KYC, I'm ready to go. No, it's ID, AML, suitability, and suitability depending on the regulation you're using. So if you're using, regulation D 506C, there is a different requirement versus regulation A and regulation CF or regulation 504, whatever regulation you're using, it changes. That suitability component changes. And then of course, what are the provisions on how much I can raise? Who can I target and where can I target them? So can I target everyone, accredited, non-accredited, or only credited? And then once I target that audience, what am I required to do in order to bring them in as investors in my company? What is my requirement? And when I do, who is the intermediary that I need in order to do that with? And where does that lie? And then of course, after the investor is made, has committed to making the investment, how does the bank fit in here? Why do I need, there's an escrow account. What does that escrow fit into all of this? So there's all these elements. If you follow it through, it's very, and for any lawyer that's listening here, you go, hey, Oscar, you're only talking about what we've done all these years. Agreed. We're not, that is the point that we're making here. And in the private capital markets is that we always known, if you just bring all the smart people in the room that have been doing this, they will tell, and then once you build that in, but you need to make sure that you're working with the right chain that will solve the problem for all the participants in that transaction. And all that transaction was, are you ready for this? The investor invested $100.
That's right. That's right.
Is it?
Well,
Is it?
we Yeah, we actually sat down and went through the entire life cycle of what happens to a transaction in a very simple transaction. It's a buy and a sell of $100 security. And Oscar, we came up with what, like 25 specific steps that needs to be done, right? Everything you mentioned, Oscar, is spot on, but you raised what I like to call the complexities of implementation of any smart contract, any
Oh
protocol,
God,
right?
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Oh,
yes, yes.
and here's the part that most people don't understand. People look at and they ask me about, hey, what about this Ethereum protocol? What about that protocol by somebody else, by Cardano or somebody else? And I always say, look, anybody can write a protocol. Oscar, you and I, we can sit down. We are not aeronautical engineers, but you and I, we can sit down and write a protocol to launch a space shuttle. It's easy to do, right? It's just a bunch of functions. You just define them and leave them out there. It's simple. Implementation of those functions, implementation of those is where it actually the game changes. Now you have to worry about who is implementing. Is it a certified aeronautical engineer? Is it a certified expert? Is it a certified rocket fuel expert? Right? You got to get those right people in, get their expertise and domain knowledge to now implement it and launch that. Right? Writing the protocol is the easy part. I know anybody, we can sit down for any industry unseen. We can sit down and write a bunch of functions and say, well, here are the protocol functions. Implementing that is the biggest challenge.
Well, and while you're implementing it, keeping in mind that the participants you need in order for this transaction may not want to implement this. It's not in their best interest, as we've
Exactly.
discovered. So,
Yes.
and again, the rule, the regulations. I think. Thank you, Alexander, for your note. It's dead on. You cannot start drafting anything related to blockchain smart contract without first, número uno, primero, y is with the strategy of what regulation you're going to use, for what jurisdiction, what country are you going to operate within. This whole thing of generality, I got a smart contract for the world, does not exist. I'm sorry
Yep.
to say, if anybody's got that bubble, it does not exist. Will it exist someday in the future? It might, but I will tell
Yep.
you, the financial capital markets or the capital markets have been operating, with stock exchanges worldwide, and today that's how they work. They have different rules in every different country. It works. They use technology. They've been doing this without blockchain for years, right? And look how the speed of light of programming. Now we're expanding it to the private capital markets, but that's been the biggest challenge we've noticed, you and I, is that
Yep.
once you got one part dialed, you know who all the participants are. Not all of them want to participate, and as soon as one does not, and does not want to be part of it, in particular the regulated ones. So imagine there are 3,000 plus broker dealers in the United States. If not a single one wanted to touch it, ooh, what are your options? You got to become one, and
Exactly.
that's what some, right. And then, okay, I need an SEC transfer agent, and I can tell you, of all the 400 plus, none of them wanted to touch it. So everybody, we had to become one. So now, when you become one, people, oh, okay, I'm taking care of it. We're an SEC transfer agent. No, now exactly, you are now an SEC registered transfer agent. You're not a blockchain company. You are a regulated entity. You are a regulated entity that you now need to adhere to. Getting the license is one thing, going through
Yep.
the audit is another, and all that, and getting to make sure. Just keep in mind, you're the regulated entity that's taking all the burden. You're taking all the liability if anything goes wrong with these transactions. So it's really important that that gets across to everyone, that it the private capital market has been plagued, and unfortunately, people are getting caught up in what I call the shiny light. The shiny light, I had hoped by now would gone away, but I understand it. It's so lucrative because it gets sold. Hey, there are millions and millions of potential investors in here. This is it. We're compliant. Compliant where? I can tell you
Exactly.
this
That's the
today.
point. Mhm.
This is the most important part, what I can tell you. If some company is telling you they have a blockchain with a smart contract in the United States, I will not speak of any other country right now, just in the United States, and where you are soliciting American investors from wherever part of the country in the world. I don't care if you're from country in Africa, Europe, it doesn't matter. If you're coming to the United States and you're not adhering to their rules, and what is the rule? You need to go through the front door. You need to be listed. You need to demonstrate that you have put an issuer, meaning a company, through the process for the regulators to say yes or no. And I can tell you right now, no other company has other than KoreChain to date. I'm not, and I keep saying this, it can be done. It takes time. It took us almost 3 years. It can be done. You just need to understand what the problem is and provide the solution, understanding the problem. And unfortunately, today, that problem cannot be solved with public chains. That's it. And that's
I'm
right. I
I'm
mean,
so
that's
glad you brought this
sealed.
up. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up because I think there are a couple of myths or fallacies or misperceptions that we need to dispel like right away. For our audience here, is that public chains, the origin of public chains, blockchain, is really based on native cryptocurrencies, and people need to understand that a cryptocurrency is a payment instrument. It is not a securities instrument. A cryptocurrency is a bearer instrument. Securities are non-bearer instruments. Wide difference in this, right? And the validation of a transaction and forming a consensus of putting it on the blockchain depends on what the transaction is. So for securities transactions, if I'm selling my private shares to you, Oscar, in a private company, and I do this through the blockchain, why am I supposed to wait for validation confirmation from a sheep farmer in Kenya or somebody in Timbuktu? Makes no sense. Those people have no idea what a securities contract is. They have no way of business, performing any business validation on any of the provisions of the security contract whatsoever. They don't know blue sky laws. They don't know the jurisdiction. They don't know nothing, right? So they are not parties to the contract. They are not regulated entities. They have no fiduciary responsibility for any of this stuff. So why should somebody in New Zealand approve our contract? It makes no sense at all. And for that reason, we really can't have open public chains participate in what I'd like to call the true securities contracts.
No, yeah, it's the one thing that we've worked together in building this. We needed to find. We knew we didn't know the problem. I'm not going to lie to you that hey, one day in 2016 we knew it all. No, but thank goodness we approached this from understanding, trying to get through the problem solving. And yes, we had to create a private ecosystem that only. And this is the other element that Karan said it earlier, that in the private capital markets, the only people that can write and authenticate anything are regulated participants. Only a FINRA broker dealer can say yes, you pass KYC. Only a FINRA broker dealer can say you're approved for the investment. Only a FINRA broker dealer can say you're closed and you can be added to the cap table. Only an SEC registered transfer agent can say that you can complete the transfer or the trade. So we needed to bring them all into an ecosystem where it's of trusted, regulated parties that anybody who is allowed to view the information is there, um, and ultimately, where does this benefit the investor? I said it earlier. We're imagine an investor investing $100, and imagine being the CEO of a company who has, let's say, you got 65,000 people like this, and each of them contacting you every single day. What are my rights? What can I do? Where can I go? How do I use it? This and that. All of that can be removed because you already know everything in advance and you can present it to them in a way that it tells them that's all people want. And that's how you encourage it. And that's how the smart contract ends up becoming the big winner here, because you understand all the inefficiencies of all these elements. I mean, people don't really think about this, but I mean, when a person buys $100, there's all these things in built in that are in behind the scene, and they're all interconnected to that transaction. And that transaction is golden, especially when securities regulators come
Absolutely.
knocking on your door 2 years later, right?
Uh, Absolutely. It's the ability to trace all of the supporting sub transactions, the sub documents, the legal provisions, things such as the director's resolutions, the provisions in the shareholders agreement, being able to prove that all of these transactions and all the underlying detail has been compliant with all of these specific provisions. I think that's a very powerful thing. And we always talk about the chain of trust, within this, right? It isn't simply at that point, it's being able to go all the way back and make sure that all of those things are compliant. Because a smart contract and a transaction in the financial world that we talk about, Oscar, is only as strong as its weakest link. Wherever that weakest link is, if that breaks, the whole thing breaks.
It does. It does. And so again, this does this mean at all what we're saying that there's no possible way anybody else can do it? Absolutely not. I want to be very clear on this. That's the reason we published everything. And I believe there are many people here, lawyers and all that, that are ready to engage, but only to make sure. And the one thing that you need to be aware of when you're creating a smart contract for blockchain for the private capital markets in the United States. So I'm going to keep repeating that just to make sure it's clear. Make sure that you draw it out from end to end. You have to, because it is end to end. So it's going to be from the beginning, from from the company to from its filing all the way until the investor finds an exit or you find an exit for your company. And when you do that, you meet all the requirements of the regulators, you're going to have a very successful blockchain smart contract company. Because look, we're dealing with, to give everybody an idea, so from a dollar amount, it's a $4.5 trillion sector. 4.5 trillion. So that's number one. Number two, there's over 38 million privately held companies in the United States, 450 million worldwide. We're not going to solve all the problems overnight, but we need to start getting some commonality and understanding that regulators now are not going to change. And they're not going to change because the rules are there to protect investors. Do they want innovation? The answer is yes. You can innovate. You can be very disruptive in your innovation, but it doesn't always have to be at the cost of the investor. So we already seen that, and we're not here to unravel that any further, but we already learned from it. And what we learned is that the intent was, this was the intent. There could have been things done to prevent it. Companies could have filed. Now there's no excuse for that. You want to raise money for your company and you want to use a provider and you want to sell it to the general public and you're, including the United States or from the United States, then there's a way to do it compliantly. So you don't have to give the money back or you don't have to wear an orange outfit, right? So those are the things, the realities people need to face, and you need to draw that out. For smart contracts, for any other forms of applications out there, healthcare and all that, you need to apply the same concept.
The same concept, yes.
Same concept. Because the other day I was talking to a company, hey, Oscar, I know you guys have this technology. Can we use it for healthcare? I said, of course you can use it for healthcare, but we're not healthcare experts. Oh, it's really, really simple. I'm not going to assume that at all. You said healthcare, I'm thinking regulators, I'm thinking government. There's got to be a whole bunch of different things that haven't been thought of, and this is where people get into trouble. And same thing in real estate. People keep saying, "Oh, Oscar, real estate is going to be the biggest market for tokenization and smart." It's a game changer. It is, but here's the part that people keep missing out on. Right now, in order to change the game, you've got to change who controls the data. And unfortunately, that will never be a privately held company. That is already instilled in governments, right? So governments need to be shown how to use the technology first, and they need to adapt whichever form they're going to based on the problem. And then based on that, then they're going to release the next part. So when we can start building the rest of the application layer. Right?
And so I just want to make a very quick comment on this one. So there's some really good discussion on the chat. And Jan said, part of the ERS is 3643. You can also have on-chain, off-chain kind of provisions applied. And I agree with that. I mean, the challenge is always going to be this. People start out with a public chain, and then they find out all the limitations, and now they have to do off-chain processing and put an oracle to validate that piece. And now you're bringing back the intermediaries, you're bringing back all of the inefficiencies that natively occur outside now back into this, right? So it's like taking a car and trying to sail the seas, right? You have a car, and now you add a fin to that one, and you add a rudder to that, and a sail to that. And why not just buy a boat, right? It's pretty simple. So take the specific instrument and the platform and the technology that actually works natively with that, with all these provisions built in, so you don't have to retrofit so many of the other things. So I just wanted to kind of address that problem.
No, actually, that's a great analogy, because we often run into that, where people come after the fact, and the very things that the smart contract was supposed to make efficient, you bring it back. And here's the part: as soon as you bring them back, the cost just doubled, because now they need to verify, because now you're verifying two sets of records. And I can tell you this right now: lawyers don't like that, auditors don't like that, and neither do regulators, because which book is the source of truth? And that's the source of truth becomes critical, because recently broker dealers, the industry is going through what is going through attestations review. And so attestations review is: when did Kiran Garimella receive this? When did Kiran Garimella agree to this? And when did Kiran Garimella give you this? And people go, that's easy, you track it. Yes, but if you have two sets of records, which one is true? Which one is it? Because if there's a slight difference between them in any way, you've destroyed everything. And that's why, I mean, look, there's been certain companies in this space that were here dealing with the general public. They moved up to the institutional side. Why? Because it's smaller, less. So I want to be
Exactly.
also very clear that the smart contracts and the private capital markets we're talking about is dealing with everyday people that want to be participating. If you want to talk about the institutional side of it, I believe it's still going in this way, but they have more flexibility. Why? Because the regulators say, you're big boys, or you're big organizations. You can afford to do whatever you want, where it's limited to only 100 of them. But then again, the value of the smart contract, not so much on the quantity of people, but the size of the transaction. You were going to
And
say,
and,
Chris?
and and the thing, our vision really is to democratize the private capital markets, right? Anything that the institutions do, they need efficiencies of scale, and that's the reason they go after the private equity, the big, large institutional type of transactions. But that is not the same as democratization of the retail investors in the private markets, which is sort of our vision, and we share this with many other folks as well.
Correct, correct. So the key, look, the takeaways for everybody today, I know we're extended a little bit out. It's just look at the problem. Number one, smart contracts are not going to they're not going to solve your issue if you don't look at the problem, all of it. That's number one. Number two, before you even get to the smart contract, get to the problem, understand it from end to end. You'd be surprised. You've got to just, especially when you're getting into where everybody's going: financial, capital markets, healthcare, the big ones. For all of those, I guarantee you need to get through it. You need to find out everything that regulates it all the way down the line. You're dealing with money, and when money's moving, trust me, there are regulations to be followed. Once you have that, then you're in a position to begin the project, to start creating your smart contracts in play. If you want to look at ours is again, I told you earlier, you can go to Edgar, Google CoreChain, and it's all laid out for you there. And what that means is that was one of the requirements we had to do in order to show the regulators that everything we were doing was following the regulations. That this is how it's going to manage it. Meaning that nothing was removed from the ecosystem. Just because there's a smart contract doesn't mean you remove the broker dealer, you remove all the participants. They have a part to play, and the smart contract can still make it efficient, but they still have a part to play. You cannot remove them out of the equation. And that's another thing you need to consider, is that because in the earlier days, people go, "Hey, Oscar, we wrote a protocol for SEC, for transfer agent." I said, "Fantastic, this is great. Have you gone to the SEC with it yet?" Well, no, we wrote it. No, but that's you didn't read the rule. The rule is it's an actual firm, not an activity. The activity has to be performed by a transfer agent. That is fantastic. Now, what you need is an SEC transfer agent to then, melt that into their book of records and how they're going to work. So always look at it that way. I think we leap too much forward on getting excited about the technology, that we've forgotten that we're
Yes.
solving real big problems that have some major consequences if people do not do the right thing right at the beginning. And you cannot undo what you've done. If anything goes wrong, which you and I often in a position of trying to help companies, sometimes we just can't help anyone because it's already too late. By the time it's already unraveled, somebody's filed a complaint, and by then it's already too late. Now you need lawyers and all of that to unravel something. So stay safe, work through the problem. Smart contracts are, as Dr. Kiran has alluded to, they can be so powerful when implemented correctly. And I will leave all of you with this. Most of the large corporations today and many verticals have implemented smart contracts. And the reason they don't tell you about it is the same reason they don't tell you how they manage their corporate affairs. And that is
Exactly.
why blockchain is keep living, because it is being implemented. It is being implemented. Companies like IBM, they're implemented in big, large institution banks. Banks are using blockchain technology internally. They don't publicize it. They don't do it. Why do they need to? It's part their infrastructure. They don't need to do that. But for the rest of us who are trying to innovate and try to bring some changes in the market, just make sure you do it in this fashion in whatever vertical you're doing. So when those other markets emerge, you have the ability to integrate a lot more smoother in the space that you're going after. And do not assume for one moment just because one player is doing it is okay, or that it will apply to the region you're going into. So I hope today's session was enjoyable. I know that again, our sessions are always about blockchain, and in the private capital markets. Is the only space we know. We talk a little bit about the other sectors. I want to thank everybody for the questions. I know there were a few of them. Alexandra, thank you for your comments. We had a few people out there. Paul, questions. I want to thank everybody. You can reach us if you have questions. We're going to try to get all your feedback that you brought us back. This is how we communicate. You give us information. All that data is going to help us, and things are evolving. They are evolving. Now, before I go, I think we covered this, but I think we did. I thought we didn't cover this session at all, but we did. Till next week, everyone, have an amazing week wherever you may be. Try to enjoy it. And by the way, the videos are always going to be available to you. I know our team, Guillermo, will be emailing everybody a link to it, or you can go to our YouTube channel at KoreChain, or go to KoreSummit.com, or you can go to KoreChain.com. We have many different locations where you can access the information. Thank you again. Have an amazing week. Till next time. Thanks, Kiran.
Bye now.